So we'll get started in just a minute with the conversation. Where did George go? So hello again. Thank you for joining us. And forgot to thank Netflix actually, who helped produce the film and who gave us permission to do a free screening. Of course, the movie is on Netflix, so you can tell your friends and they can watch it. But it definitely seemed like one of those films that it's great to have a community gathered to then talk about afterwards. So that's what we're going to do now. So we've got two of our three panelists up here. We have a third coming in a second who are involved with NYU's prison education program. So I'm going to have them introduce themselves and what they do for that program, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to talk about one thing in the film that they want to talk about. Obviously, there's a lot to think about and talk about, but maybe after you talk about your... Hey, George. Hey, join us. After you talk about what you do for NYU's prison education program, if there's one thing that you want to talk about from the film that might help us also turn to the community, get your thoughts and your questions, either for the panelists or just your thoughts about the film as well. So we'll start with you three in your introductions, and then we'll open it up, all right? Nikhil, do you want to start for us?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Is it working? Okay. I'm Nikhil Singh. I'm an associate professor in the departments of social and cultural analysis and history. And I've written quite a bit about the history of the Black freedom movement and the civil rights movement in particular. And I'm also the faculty director of the NYU Prison Education Program, which is a co-sponsor of this event. And we are currently running a program toward an associate's degree in liberal studies at Wallkill Correctional Facility, which is about an hour and 45 minutes upstate. We have about 50 students enrolled, and then we're also working with all of our students when they get out of prison, especially those that parole to New York City, and helping them to continue with their educational goals, to meet their educational goals. So that program's been going for about 2 years, and I'm happy to talk more about it. Both George and Piper have been involved heavily as teachers in the program and as members of the program steering committee. So I'm happy to be here and chat with you about the film we just saw. Thanks.
I see a bunch of people on the side there. I just want you to know that there's seats over here, so if you wanted to come over here and join us, you can. There's plenty of seats, so you could always come over here and be a part of the conversation. My name is Piper Anderson. I am a writer, educator, professor here at Gallatin, as well as in the prison education program, and a cultural worker. I've been teaching at Gallatin for the last 6 years, courses that look at the intersections of criminal justice, education, and the arts, and the role of culture in creating change. My course here is a community learning course, and so my students each semester have been going into Rikers Island and running a program there with incarcerated 16 and 17-year-olds. And then, of course, part of the faculty steering committee for the prison education program, and on the faculty. You asked us to talk about something that you want us. Yeah. Oh, after. Okay. All right. So
Maybe we'll have the intros, and then maybe one thought, something you want to bring up from the film.
Okay, so this works. My name is George Schulman. I teach at Gallatin. I've taught here for 20 years now. I teach political theory and sort of American politics with a special focus on the relationship between race and American political culture. And I have been involved in the prison program since its beginning. It's been very important to Gallatin that we be involved in that program, because historically Gallatin was understood as the university without walls and was committed to breaking down barriers between university and the world beyond it. And This is an extension for me, in my mind, of the real deep educational mission, which I see as also a political mission of the school.
Yeah, I was going to say that I just recently heard Ava DuVernay, the director, say she really wanted this to be 100 minutes. It had to be 100 minutes because she didn't think, although it could be hours and hours and hours, she wanted it to be something people could watch and learn, and she packs so much in that 100 minutes. So maybe to start us off, some thing or two that strikes you as something that you want to talk about to start us off tonight. Thank you.
So this semester I'm teaching a course called Say Her Name about women and girls in the prison system. And so I think a lot about the impact of state violence on women and girls, and the ways that women, girls, trans people, and gender nonconforming people experience incarceration. And so, you know, in watching the film, what strikes me is that that it's not the whole story of incarceration. That Ava DuVernay, who is an incredible filmmaker, who in her repertoire of films usually tells the stories of Black women and tells them in these incredibly powerful and nuanced ways. And if she doesn't get that incarceration includes the experiences of women, girls, and trans people, then I'm not sure anybody can. So that's one thing that really struck me. And I think it's important to name that that is not the whole story, right? That is one particular story, the story of Black male incarceration, and using the experience of Black males and who are incarcerated to talk about this long history of racial control within the country. And it's done really, really well. But I didn't see represented either, you know, the voices of formerly incarcerated women, other than the ones that we know really well, like Angela Davis and Assata Shakur. But, you know, modern day sheroes like Donna Hilton and Topeka Sam and Andrea James, women from the National Council of Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, who actually spoke at the law school this past couple of weeks ago. So I think that's important to name, and it's something that's sadly is missing from this larger conversation. Probably not.
So I'll say a couple things. I think it's tempting for those of us who are in this field to, I think, want to take this film apart in various ways, and I think Piper just opened up a really crucial avenue of critique, and I have several myself, and maybe we'll get to that. So I don't want to. I think the critique is actually very, very important. It's very hard what she's trying to do in 100 minutes, but at the same time, there are aspects of the film that don't actually always lead us down the path that we need to go if we're going to actually understand the full scope, as Piper just said, of hyper-incarceration or mass incarceration, but also kind of where its center of gravity really rests, which is often in the kind of local prison and jail, where the massive numbers of people are arrested and processed and locked up, often without charges, or certainly without having been convicted. I think there's about 12 million arrests per year in the United States, which is a massive number, and a lot of people have talked extensively about collateral consequences of the criminal punishment system, the people who are taken out of communities and all the people that are affected who are still in the so-called free world but are connected to people who are inside. So when we really start to examine the scope of it, we really see how it is not a discrete phenomenon, but it's one that's kind of in a capillary way throughout every aspect of our society. And I don't always think that the film captures that. A film that does capture it really quite brilliantly also just recently came out. It's called The Prison in 12 Landscapes by Brett Story, which is a much more difficult and challenging film in many ways, but I highly recommend it, and it's gotten a lot of acclaim. So the thing that I would say that really, I think, is powerfully done in this film and really well done and really crucial is that it shows the long arc of criminal stigma and how that is attached to blackness, how that is attached to race, particularly in the aftermath of slavery. And we see it through the 13th Amendment and the exception for punishment of a crime. But there's a very long and significant history that even precedes slavery. I mean, I think it's Benjamin Franklin who says, the slave is by nature a thief. So there's a kind of way in which the markings of race and the markings of criminality actually are kind of braided, and there's a way in which criminality starts to take over, particularly in the moment in which it becomes sort of formally unacceptable to stigmatize people on the basis of race. And so that's the kind of second story that I think the film does a brilliant job of showing, which is that just as we get to the moment of formal racial equality, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the moment in which the United States for the first time in its history becomes a liberal democracy, an interracial democracy, you then have this kind of a very explicit ratcheting up of what Lyndon Johnson, who's the architect of the War on Poverty and who doesn't really appear in the film, or maybe he appears once, calls a war within our borders in 1967. And that really is the beginning of the launching of a war on crime and the allocation of massive amounts of federal money for the first time to local jurisdictions to begin this inner war. And of course that develops through the Nixon administration and then particularly Reagan, and also we see it in Clinton. And there's a long arc, and I think the film does a really good job of showing how this carceral state, this criminal punishment state, really grows after 1970 in a kind of unprecedented way. It's a massive commitment of resources, but it's all filtering out into the state and local jurisdictions. And of course, it leaves us with this tremendously racially bifurcated, racially targeted system that Michelle Alexander has called the new Jim Crow, and we could assess whether that's a good or accurate or helpful label or not. But I think what it does mark is that kind of way in which there's this sort of continuity in the regimes of racial domination, even if they change form, and that's what we are now living under.
I'll just quickly add that some of that funding went towards, a huge amount of that funding went towards local police jurisdictions, and particularly data collection. So for the first time, police jurisdictions are collecting data. And when you start collecting data, it creates the perception that there's an increase in crime, right? And so when people are in the film are talking about this, there was this increase in crime. Well, there was actually an increase in data collection that gives the perception. And so it's argued, you can argue whether or not there was actually an increase in crime, or if there was the creation of new systems of data collection around crime. Some of that focusing on breaking it out by race creates this perception, and then that triggers what we.
So I guess I have two things to add. One is I rather than talk about what my criticisms of the film might be, I guess what I was most struck by watching it for the first time tonight after the election of Trump is first what Nikhil describes, which is the long arc by which you see exactly what's not new about Trump, the way in which there is this language of law and order based on assumptions of criminality that are racialized, that goes all the way back in our history, and that kind of argument and appeal linked to the police power of the state remains a kind of central thread and organizing symbolism in the culture, and still mobilizes massive numbers of people like Birth of a Nation did. And that seems to me to be, until if questions about mass incarceration or reform, quote unquote, of mass incarceration are not connected to that engine in American history, then, as I guess it was Van Jones said, there'll just be a new kind of constitution of racial oppression in some new form, but that the confrontation with what Trump means and what it means that he's emerging now as these figures have recurrently emerged, that seems to me to be sort of the central challenge politically, which is, again, I guess, you could say, is why Black Lives Matter is so important and the kind of work that it's doing. So that was the first thing that really knocked me out. And the second thing, and I would probably emphasize this more than the film, is how much the recent reconstitution of criminality was directly in response to the 60s, which was the last time of mass insurgency in the country, and the one moment, at least in my sort of lifetime, in which the racial constitution of the state linked to a kind of imperial war, linked to the state's violence. That was the last moment that was really confronted head on. And immediately you saw this massive kind of repression and re-symbolizing of danger, so that political insurgency was recast as criminality. And that, to me, is was like the spark plug for what happened subsequently. And you can see, again, I think, and whether, I mean, I don't know what to say about the likelihood of success, but you can see that language and that mobilization, or I would say that counter-mobilization, again now.
Great, thank you. So, any questions for our panelists or comments about the film you want to share with the group? We'll start here.
Hi. I wanted to raise a question about the reinforcement of racial stereotypes that the film visits, but not long enough or not deep enough, because that's a very, very important thing. We are into a vicious cycle here. All the images that we see on the news, in films, and it's like all these racial stereotypes and the criminal stereotypes that keep coming back and then reinforcing, like they were saying, not only in the black, also in the black community, as well as everybody else. And that is so terrible. It's really the worst thing that can happen. And it keeps going on in our films and in our media, on our television, and that is where really it all lies. So I don't know if you have any comments on that. We would like to.
Mine is not so much a question as it is a comment. I was really taken of the connection between Birth of a Nation and the onslaught. I have an ancestor, a 3 times great uncle, who was lynched in Abbeville, South Carolina in 1916, October 21st, 1916. And Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, and I hadn't made that, put it in that historical context. He was the wealthiest black man, black or white, in Abbeville County, and he was lynched for impudence. He spoke out. He wasn't getting a fair price for some seed, and because he was impudent, he was lynched. And our family fled Abbeville, South Carolina, and that's how I ended up being born in Philadelphia, and we're scattered throughout the country. But that really leapt out at me and gave me some form of context in which to put my ancestors' lynching.
Anything about the first comment or question?
Hi. Is it on? Okay. In response to the initial comment that was made, I don't think she gave her name, about the stereotypes in the throughout the film. I think that the most important thing probably is just for us to arm ourselves with knowledge. I don't think that anything that they say on the news or anything, you know, that they try to project is ever going to change. Sadly, I mean, it will change eventually, but not anytime soon. And what I said to you guys right after the film ended was that I think that the thing that struck me the most was the attention that's paid to the propaganda. That's the scariest part for me, because I was like laughing at the things that Reagan was saying. It's absurd to me, you know, but people are listening and they're playing on people's fears, and they're internalizing these things and thinking that, okay, this is how I need to operate, or this is how I need to view certain people. I grew up with friends, Hispanic friends in my high school, that told me that if they saw a black man running towards them in the street, they would turn and cross the street or go the opposite way. That's scary. Like, honestly, it is. And it's all stems from the propaganda, in my personal opinion. That's just what I think it is. I think that the objective is to just arm yourselves with your own personal knowledge.
Anybody else up here? Okay.
I'll give it to you. Thank you. This lady mentioned Birth of a Nation, and in the film, I recall a line saying that President Woodrow Wilson saw the film. He's a very educated man, the former president of Princeton, the president of the United States, sees that film. We now have another president who is, I don't know if he really has a Wharton degree, but anyway, I would say the way he speaks and the way he acts, I don't care how much money he has, he sounds very uneducated, unfeeling, tyrannical, demagoguery, whatever. Okay. Firstly, does anybody in the panel here know whether getting the release for these film chains that were put into the film had to be cleared with Donald Trump? Does he know about this film? Has he seen this film? Because something very important in there. When we see all this violence and we go back to what it was before and where we are now, we have a president who is on tape in this film. They take the breath out of her. While we're watching the thin black gentleman in the South in the black and white, cutting back to the woman in the green thing where they're punching her, this back and forth, and the narration under with Donald Trump is very scary. I sat here and I know that I heard while I was watching, punch him in the nose, I'll pay for the legal, I'll pick up the legal. Then he said he didn't say it, but we have it on the tape. That's not that piece. However, what are children going to think when their president is saying this is the way it should be? I am your president, the law and order candidate. I mean, what are we supposed to think? We're feeling for all of these people who are in jail with mass incarceration. It's almost unbelievable. It feels like we're, South Africa, the way we're looking at this film. What about the filmmaker omitting white crime and white-collar crime? And what kind of prisons are they in? Maximum security, lockdown 24 hours, or boutique prisons? I think there would have been something a little more fair to say that I don't know how many black people are doing black-collar crime, because there isn't that much money. But the corporations that are involved with these prisons and making money off the labor, off the architecture, off the whole deal. We're sitting in a building right now that is using that caterer, Amarak, that got picked up of having maggots in the food or whatever it is. They are the major caterers for this university, for all the receptions they have, and so on and so forth. So we're all in this together, and we have to get out of it together. And I don't
You're
know
absolutely
with
right.
this
We're-
president
we're
what's
all-
going to happen.
We're all, I think what you're alluding to is that we're all complicit in some way. And I think that under this president in particular, we're called to really look at the ways that we're complicit. That, you know, I think that's what I'll say for right now. I feel like you were going to say something.
Well, I want to. I actually want to. I want to say several things here. So first of all, I think the point of looking at mass incarceration through this film, and one of the things that we can start to pull out of it, is maybe not so much the question of complicity as much as the question of how it's at the core of the political challenges that face all of us. And let me just give a few examples because they don't really get touched on in the film. Lackawanna County, one of the biggest counties in Pennsylvania that went for Trump, it's 92% white. It also has incarceration rates that are higher than incarceration rates of any county in New York City, any county in Chicago. It's off the charts, 92% white. It's a center of opioid addiction. It's a center of unemployment. It's a center of declining mortality rates. And even though it's 92% white, African Americans and Latinos in Lackawanna County are still incarcerated at 15 times the rate of whites in Lackawanna County. So there's still racial disparity, but there's more whites overall in prison in that county than blacks and Latinos. So one of the things that we kind of miss sometimes when we focus on racial disparity alone is that mass incarceration is a wide net. It's the same way that we sometimes miss when we focus on the history of Jim Crow or the history of slavery, the ways in which this was also a system designed to oppress and disfranchise poor white people. Now, poor white people don't always see it that way, and this is where questions of stereotype come in. You imagine that because black people are locked up 15 times the rate that you are in Lackawanna County, that you're somehow not a tremendous victim of this exact same system if you're a poor white person. At least oftentimes that happens, right? And when we look at Donald Trump, he is someone who has made his political career on this. He started in 1989 calling for a literal lynching of the Central Park Five. That was his inauguration in the field of public political discourse. And he went from there onward, right? So he moved from there forward. This is the kind of thing that we are clearly dealing with. And so it's been said over the last few years that we're moving away from a system of mass incarceration. There's been this bipartisan call for reform. You see Newt Gingrich in that film. He was a close advisor of Trump. But now what we're actually seeing happening is actually the imagination of another leg of mass incarceration with the movement towards a scale of deportation and immigrant detention that we have not actually seen. Obama deported a lot of people, 2 to 3 million, but Trump is imagining something on a scale that's much, much, much greater than that, and it actually involves building more detention facilities. One of the misleading things about the film is it suggests that there's a huge influence of private prisons. Well, private prisons are a very, very small percentage of the investment in prisons. Most prisons are paid for on the public dime, and they're public facilities. There's state facilities, there's local facilities, and there are federal facilities. But immigrant detention facilities are actually heavily privatized, and this is one of the arenas where actually they see an opportunity, I think, for growth. So when we look at the system and when we see what's happening, we have to recognize, and I think the film is good at it's sort of showing this, that it's a moving target. It's mutating. It's metastasizing in some very, very frightening ways. And its web encompasses more and more and more of the population. And the final point I want to make on this is that we have been living under 15 years or more of what's been called the global war on terror. What's been at the heart of the global war on terror? Detention, incarceration, It's been a regime that's been built upon the idea of taking people and locking them up, and torturing them. And those facilities often were set up by people who got their training inside American prisons as guards, as wardens, right? They learned in those facilities how to do what they went on to do in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and other places. Again, it's a kind of missed opportunity in the film, but we have to sort of be able to connect up this kind of inner war that has been going on against the poor, and particularly the black and brown poor, and the outer war that kind of continually provides these kind of renewable pretexts for it, which we now see with the emergence of Trump. Obama marked a kind of pause in some ways, and not an effective rolling back, really, of these dynamics that have been going on these decades. And now we're really confronted with this, I think, at the center of the political crisis that faces us.
The thing I would add to that is people would say the question of Jim Crow was isolated in the South. There are all ways that we have of kind of putting a boundary around a racial system, and that that would be to misunderstand how the Jim Crow system worked, as well as how the implication of the whole nation in slavery. And likewise, in the case of mass incarceration, I mean, Nikhil's example of Lackawanna is that in many cases for many areas in the country, the collapsing economy was in some way answered by building prisons and employing people in prisons, so that the implication in the whole system runs all the way across the society, both in terms of who builds them, who funds them, who works in them, and the percentages of who is in them. And I think the incarceration point is really powerful. The need to punish in this society, the fear of people's freedom, is so old. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Much as we talk about the meaning of America is freedom and so on, the shadow of that is equally intense, of the fear of what people will do with it, and the impulse to punish is as old as the country.
I think we have time for 2 more, so we're going to go here, and then we have to.
I hope that you all will comment. I'm a middle school teacher. I work with 11 to 13-year-olds in Central Harlem, and many of them boys. And I sit here and think about my boys and think about how closed they seem to be, or guarded they seem to be, from the information presented in this film. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how early is too early and how late is too late to start the conversation about what these young men and women are targeted for, so that they don't make the mistakes that I see them make every day. And I have occasion to say every day, you need to practice coping skills, diplomacy skills on me, because if you do to a cop what you do to me, you could land at the cemetery. So please give me some guidance on when to have this conversation with a child.
So Sesame Street created a really great toolkit and a character whose parent is incarcerated, and a toolkit for talking to young children about this. Because the fact is that there are nearly 3 million children who have an incarcerated parent, right? So this is something that they live, right, every single day. They deal with the reality of a parent being away. And if that child's primary parent who's incarcerated is a mother, then they're more likely to end up in foster care as a result, because most of the women who are incarcerated are mothers. Many of them lose their parental rights. They were the head of the household before they went to prison. And now their children are now in a new system that is now criminalizing them as well. So it's never too early to have the conversation. They're thinking about it. They're curious about it. They want to know about it. Their friends are dealing with it as well. And I think that there's a way that we can have these conversations with children that don't create the perception that it's something that they have to do, right? That there's some way in which they have to act in order to protect themselves from a system that is clearly designed, as we can see, to criminalize them based on the color of their skin, not based on how they act or their behavior, but on the color of their skin. You know, I live in Central Harlem as well, and I remember, walking down the street and just like seeing the way that when a police officer walks up, like just to, 3 young men just walking down the street, they stop, they put their hands up. They are conditioned to understand that their bodies are not their own. That if a police officer stops them, they have no choice but to be patted down, to be frisked, and they have no say over it. So they see it and experience it every day. But what we can help them understand is on a larger context that this is not your fault, right? You didn't do anything to deserve this. And that it's all of our responsibility. So when I say we're all complicit in this, what I mean is that we all have a responsibility to not just watch what we say and what we, and the kind of images that we consume, but that we look at the invisible structures all around us that are dictating the quality of a life of a child growing up in Central Harlem or any part of this country. And that's what we're missing. And part of the reason why I brought up this piece about the missing story of women, of queer folks, of trans folks in this film is that when you don't talk about that, then you don't see the full impact that this has on communities. You can't talk about gun violence or economic issues or domestic violence or anything else if you don't talk about women being incarcerated. Incarceration of women has increased 1,000% in the last 30 years. While they're there's a tiny little, population in comparison to the number of men, about less than 20%. But the rates of incarceration for women are increasing at a ridiculous rate. And most of them are there for economic crimes and for drug crimes, trying to take care of their children, trying to take care of their families. So when Obama is offering clemency, offering more clemencies than any other president in the United States, over 1,000 clemencies, 1,176 clemencies. Do you know how many of those are for women? 76. 76. So when I say that this story is incomplete, right? We don't even know. No, we didn't even think about that, right? Because this is the only story that we hear. It's the story of men. When women have always been the linchpin that holds families together. And when a woman goes to prison, that leads to the complete demise of that family. It has led to the huge expansion of our foster care system. So we really have to. One last thing I'll say is that at the end of this month, on February 27th, we're going to screen a documentary about Donna Hilton, a woman who spent 27 years in prison, here in this room, and she'll be here to talk to us. And so finding those stories, I think, is really, really critical.
We have to take 2 more. We'll do right here, and then there's 1 more up there. We have to do 2 more, and then we can talk afterwards informally as. Yeah, I'm gonna get up there. I'm gonna get up there as well. And since Piper mentioned, there is you have the program and events calendar for events that are free and open to the public here, screenings, talks, panels coming up as well. So do here and here, and then.
One thing that I think the film did really well was connect the prison industrial complex with the economic system in this country, with capitalism. And that of course, goes back to slavery and before that. And it's not just about profits, it's about politics as well, and the way these are imbricated. So how can the prison industrial complex be dismantled without also dismantling capitalism? And I'm not saying capitalism shouldn't be dismantled. I'm saying that how do you attack or how do you disengage a system that is so much a part of how this country operates, not just on terms of race and social interactions, but in terms of profit, but daily subsistence for all of us. Well, subsistence isn't always there, but does that make sense?
Hi, I'm Jessie. Just graduated from Gallatin, so I'm very excited to be here. So I have a lot on my mind. I'm like feeling so much because watching that is just so painful, right? But I want to speak to what Piper was talking about the women, and that historically the country or the oppressor has targeted men as the point at which that's the weakest point of the family. If you target the man doubts the man doubts the man, the child doubts the man ceased to exist, so the family doesn't exist. And so that book is the Willie Lynch letter on how to make a slave, whatever, if you want to look that up. And then to connect that to the part where she connects, or Ava shows the girl being pushed to the man being pushed. There's so much to be said about oppression that there's no way you can speak about women being oppressed and men being oppressed and transgender, non-gender conforming people and immigrants and all those people all in one. So I think she did a great job in just piecing together the beginning of it. And then also the fact that we need to be shocked in these photos, but also challenge yourself in how you even question it. If what you're looking at is all you're thinking about, then you're not doing the work in really thinking about the world that we're in. And it really hurts my heart because watching this makes me think of the Laramie Project and the gay guy who is like beat and, you know, paraded around his dead body. And the movie The Oriented is about queer bodies or Palestinian, Arab identifying people within Israel, and you know, all that, and everything is connected. Even my uncle will say to me, it's worse to be a black man. Yeah, what black women, it's not that bad. But if you're ever comparing oppression, then you're already lost in some aspect. Being lost is not a problem because there is always a way to be found, but you should never compare oppression. And if you're watching movies, if you're watching these images of oppression, challenge yourself to think beyond that. Think about the person next to you. Don't let, you know, the instant photos make you stop questioning, like, okay, what is that person going through? That kid from the Bronx, I'm sure I've passed him being from the Bronx, like mental health and things like that. Just question yourself. And about the kids in school, I would recommend reading Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Coelho, or Coelho, yeah. He's a Brazilian thinker, social activist and everything. Look him up because he teaches that it's never too early to bring social injustice, justice, awareness in the classroom, because that's where you learn, that's where you question, and that's where you grow. And there's just so much, but thank you for all of your opinions, because you all make us better, as I can say for myself. And it's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So panelists, anything you want to leave us with tonight?
So I'll say two things. One is, one of the reasons we started the prison education program was not just to try to open New York University to communities that have not had access to New York University, but to actually, in a very small way, think about what it might mean to help people who are formerly incarcerated to become leaders in the next phase of the challenge to this system, which also means people who have had the experience, who've been criminalized, who've been locked up, can come out with empowered with a certain amount of knowledge and perspective and understanding and ability to tell their stories, and also examine and analyze the conditions that we are facing. So one of the things that occurs to me vis-a-vis your issue is ways we might actually think in a really proactive way about developing more educational programs that connect, again, what we're doing in the university to the schools, underserved, under-resourced. And again, this is part of the story of mass incarceration, the withdrawal of resources from welfare, from public housing, from education. Where do those go? Those go into the criminal punishment system. There's a direct, you can follow the money, right? You can follow the money. The state which says it can't do all of these things for people, it can't do social welfare anymore, it spends too much on education, it can't spend on public housing, but you have a bond to build a jail and there's no problem raising money for it, right? So that's really, in some ways, the key story politically, is that the state can do punishment. You know, it can do it can do criminal justice or criminal injustice. You know, and it can do these things because it mobilizes a politics of fear, and it mobilizes a politics of race, and it mobilizes a politics of division. So to challenge these things, we have to be able to mobilize against all of those kinds of things, the politics of fear, the politics of racism, the politics of division. And we have to try to develop and build an argument about the state once again making commitments to us and to our social welfare. Now, that is not expressly an anti-capitalist argument necessarily. It might be a social democratic argument. I think it is misleading to think of prisons as being primarily for private profit. As I said before, and I know you're not saying that, but I think that can come through when we focus on private prisons. There's a lot of money sloshing around in that system, but it's money sloshing around to basically keep people in enforced idleness, not to put them to work, but to warehouse them, to cool them out, to move them out of the world, in fact. And in that way, it's a terribly brutal inversion of slavery, right? Not the same by any means. So I think we're still taking the measure of what mass incarceration means, and to undo it certainly does and will certainly involve a wholesale political revolution in this country. There's no question about it. And it has to be front and center in the demands that we're making in this period in terms of what we're facing with the Trump administration.
I want to thank you. And
So I'm going to go ahead and continue to be the black feminist on the panel who's beating this drum, which is that, so one of the things that didn't get said was, so we talked about Black Lives Matter in this, and in the document, in the film. But what didn't get said is that black women lead that movement, right? What didn't get said was that it was created by black women, right, who have demanded that we think about these issues in an intersectional way, that we recognize that yes, all of our oppressions are bound together, and that if we are going to get out of this, that we have to all be at the table, and we have to all be working together to do it. That we can't just wait for men to get free and then think that women are going to follow. That's not how it works at all. And the other thing that I want you to think about is that many of the really great solutions, much of the work around prison abolition, around transformative justice, about models of addressing harm in communities that don't depend on police or prison, come from black feminists, come from feminists of color, right? So the work to end criminalization, to dismantle the prison system, is done by the very people that we continue to invisibilize as we talk about this work. And they're still fighting for everyone. So as we go forward, and I know it's really easy to sort of, make reasons why we can't include this in the conversation, and yet we have to, because it's the only way that we get free. The other thing that I'll say is that, the film talks about Bill Clinton and the Democrats. And what you hear from Democrats over and over in the film is like, well, we didn't know. We didn't know it was going to end up like this. We didn't get the result that we had hoped for. And it's not that they didn't get the result that they had hoped for. It's that our politics, and we're seeing this again now, is that we're like, well, let's just swing the House blue again. That's now the new call, right? It's like, let's just get Democrats back in office without holding them accountable. And if they know that they're not going to be held accountable by us, then there's no incentive for them to really care about the long-term consequences of their policies. And so as we find ourselves in the same situation again, we can't make the same mistakes, right? We can't just say Democrats swinging the House blue is going to save us. Because whether the House is blue or red, my people still end up in orange, okay? And so we need a new strategy.
Thank you. I encourage you, if you want to look up about the NYU Prison Education Program, you can look at their website. You can find more events like this at NYU Gallatin's website. Thank you so much and have a great night.